The ancient Greeks are known for their many contributions to society, and most of these are pretty familiar to us. But instead of rehashing those and doing yet another video on the Antikythera mechanism, today we're going to go over 5 lesser known inventions that we still use today that we have the ancient Greeks to thank for. Alarm clocks. Even though nowadays the alarm clock has been watered down to a point where in most cases all it is just an app on a phone, the alarm clock actually traces its roots all the way back to ancient Greece, with Plato himself possessing one of the earliest known examples in history. At this point, the most accurate clocks were water clocks that told time with the dripping of water from one tank to another, with the amount of water that has passed used to determine the time. Now, this type of clock was in existence for a very, very long time. This point in history, though, it had replaced the sundial, and it would remain the most accurate way of telling time all the way up until the 1600s, when they'd be replaced by pendulum clocks. But the Greeks were the first to be recorded as modifying them to include various alarm systems that would be triggered by a clock mechanism. Something like activating a water organ or a dropping of a pebble onto a gong. In this point in history, water clocks had advanced pretty far past just 2 buckets with a hole. They had some advanced instruments that would be able to tell the changing of hours, and they made it so that they could be supplied by continually running water sources, so no one had to go and, refill the first chamber or the first bucket. The water could just run continually. And because of these advancements, we now have the Greeks to thank every time we hit the snooze button. Stadiums. Although many attribute stadiums to the Romans because of the Colosseum, that does not mean they can be credited with their creation. It may be the best known ancient stadium, but stadia owe their roots to the ancient Greeks. In fact, the word stadium comes from the Greek stadion, which was a measure of length and not a location. One stadion was equal to 600 feet, and at this time, 1 foot was not a standard, so it varied from one location to another. So how did this length turn into a place to view sports? Well, the first stadiums were really just a location created for sprinting events, where the competitors would run one stadium in length, and the earliest ones were very simple in their construction. The oldest stadium, the stadium at Olympia, pictured here, dates back to 776 BC, and was just made of hardened clay with stone anchors for the starting and finish line along with starting blocks. The location had raised hills for spectators, and it was used during the Olympic Games to determine who was the fastest person in the world. Well, at least in ancient Greece. These later evolved further into having seating for larger and larger crowds that they were attracting. Which brings us to our next invention, theater. Athens, one of the most well-known Greek city-states, was the birthplace of Western theater, and, like many births, it was preceded by a bunch of drunken festivities. You see, the city had a lot of festivals, and they were pretty important, so much so that attendance as an audience member was mandatory for citizenship at the city Dionysia, which was a huge event celebrating the god Dionysus. Now, early theater was not just comprised of comedies and tragedies. There was also a third type, the satyr play, which was both part comedy and tragedy, and they were generally centered around mythological heroes. Large crowds would come to see these, and as they grew popular, they would build full amphitheaters with stone seating arranged in semicircles around an orchestra and a stage. The construction techniques to make these buildings at this time merged along with ancient stadiums, and the two eventually led to what became modern stadiums and theaters as we know them today. Catapults. Tracing their roots to the crossbow, the Greeks created the changes necessary to cement the creation of the catapult. First, they started as just massive crossbows, but the Greeks used their knowledge of geometry and physics, along with some of the earliest studies of ballistics and siege warfare, to lead to many advances in catapult design. They were the first to start using torsion as a means of storing potential energy in later catapult designs, and The study and use of catapults was so commonplace in Greek culture that many children were instructed in how to use catapults, as evidenced by an inscription found on the island of Chios about the regulation of catapult competitions for the young. Torsion-based catapults were so revolutionary that they helped military conquerors at the time, like Alexander the Great, to succeed in their campaigns. And many have used these catapult building competitions to possibly determine who may end up being a good military leader in the future. The odometer. Now, we don't really know exactly who invented the odometer or when, but we do know that it was likely the ancient Greeks, and that's because of Alexander the Great. Why is that? Well, because there were accurate accounts of the distances he traveled around 330 BC, and I mean eerily accurate for the time. For example, the distance given between Hecatopolis and Alexandria at Arion only deviated by 0.2% of the actual distance, which is even more impressive when you realize the distance between them was 531 miles. This leads most people to believe that there must have been some sort of device that would have been used to measure these distances with such a high degree of accuracy, but that either it was not kept in the historical record at the time, or we just haven't found anything written about it yet. The first recorded accounts of an odometer that we know about come from Vitruvius in the 1st century BC. It was a cart that was mounted on chariot wheels, and the wheels would turn 400 times for every Roman mile. With each revolution of the wheel, it would engage a cogwheel that had 400 teeth. Thus, every time the cogwheel turned one complete revolution, that meant that they had traveled exactly 1 mile. Each turn of the cogwheel would also engage another wheel that would directly drop a single pebble into a box for every mile traveled. And so at the end of the trip, all you'd have to do was count the pebbles in the box, and you'd know the distance you traveled. Well, that's it for this video. Hopefully at least some of those are new to you. Anyway, I'm Frank Chopatini with Servetti Software, and I'll see you in the next one.